theme this year is Revolt, Rebellion, Protest, Change and Insurrection in Children's Literature. And it would be hard to find a genre more suited to all of that than fantasy. In fantasy and in science fiction, the reader may confront and possibly even grow used to ideas that would make her or him profoundly uncomfortable in realistic fiction. For instance, the first interracial kiss on television took place on Star Trek, as did a lot of other first considerations of ideas taboo to other shows. Star Trek was just science fiction. Star Trek could get away with it. Caleb Gwynne calls fantasy the oldest form of literature, the story that, quote, tells human truth, serving human community and spiritual longing, end quote. And the more concrete ideology becomes, solidifying into dogma that cannot be altered with facts, the more important than ever fantasy grows as a door into the possibility of alternatives. Every summer, Hollins welcomes a writer-in-residence to the Children's Literature Graduate Program. And this year, we're especially lucky to have not only Ellen Kushner as our writer-in-residence, but Delia Sherman on the summer faculty. Between them, they have won the World Fantasy Award, the Locus Award, the Mythopoeic Award twice. They write, separately and together, stories and novels for adults, teens, and children. Ellen's novel, Thomas the Rhymer, won the World Fantasy Award and the Mythopoeic Award. The Privilege of the Sword won the Locus Award, and she is also the author of The Golden Dreidel, Sword's Point, and Stories for Younger Readers in anthologies including The Beastly Bride and Troll's Eye View. She is the host of PRI's award-winning national public radio series Sound and Spirit, which Bill Moyers called the best program on public radio, bar none. And she is a co-founder of the Interstitial Arts Foundation, an organization encouraging work that falls between genre categories. Her most recent book, co-edited with Holly Black, is the new YA anthology, Welcome to Bordertown. Delia's novel, The Porcelain Dove, won the Mythopoeic Award. And she is also a founding member of the Interstitial Arts Foundation, for which she co-edited 2 interfictions anthologies. She is the author of middle grade novels Changeling and The Magic Mirror of the Mermaid Queen, and the forthcoming Freedom Maze. Her short stories and poetry have appeared in many young adult and middle grade anthologies. Most recently, Coyote Road, Troll's Eye View, and Welcome to Bordertown. Delia has judged the Crawford Award for Best First Fantasy Novel, the James Tiptree Jr. Award for Fantastic Fiction, and the World Fantasy Award, and served on the motherboard of the James Tiptree Jr. Award. She also teaches at Odyssey, the Fantasy Writing Workshop, and at the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop. And together, they are the authors of The Fall of the Kings. We're delighted to have them both with us for the summer term and for CHLA 38. So please join me in welcoming Ellen and Delia.
Thank you, Amanda. That was lovely. And thank you, everybody, for so warmly welcoming us to CHLA. It's a real treat to be part of a conference. I have a little bit of a feeling of having fallen down the conference rabbit hole because we were so focused on the writer-in-residence for me and the teaching for Delia that the fact that there was this conference that somehow was happening at the beginning of our term here was sort of an afterthought. And here we are suddenly in the middle of it. We have not been to as many events as we wanted because we were frantically rewriting our speech. But after 45 minutes from now, we will be fully participating in the conference, and we look forward to it very much. And please, if you want to chat with us anytime, don't hesitate. We will stop glaring at you in that sort of, I'm eating my sandwich and I have to go back and write way that we probably did earlier today. So, the theme, the theme of the conference being revolt and rebellion, we thought, aha, this is our big chance to explain why fantasy is revolting and rebellious, and why that's good. And we kind of got started walking down that road and realized that we're not scholars. Well, actually, Delia is, but she gave it up. She refers to herself as a recovering academic. So she can talk the talk, but she no longer walks the walk. And we realized we're going to make a total monkey's breath of this, and that's not, that's your job, is to be the astute academics. And so we're just, the reason we're here is as writers. And so we thought we would take a little run through our lives as readers and as writers of fantasy. We're going to do it contrapuntally. And last night we were in quite a split and sort of got as close as we ever have to a real fight about whose sections were worse. And each of us is convinced it is our own, so I hope we'll just neutralize each other out and we'll enjoy our little talk, which Delia opens.
When I was a little girl, I had a tolerably clear picture of what my life was supposed to be like when I grew up. It was everywhere around me, in the magazines I saw in the drugstore, in the movies, on TV. I'd develop a figure and an interest in boys. I'd go to dances. I'd date and get engaged and marry. And then I'd live happily ever after, eating Hamburger Helper and Pillsbury instant biscuits, keeping my floor shiny and my windows sparkling, untroubled by heartburn, bathroom germs, or ring around the collar. This was not a life that appealed to me. Nor was the life my mother led, which did not in any way, shape, or form reflect what I saw on TV. My mother did not know how to turn on a stove, and would not have used it to make Hamburger Helper even if she could. She had a housekeeper to deal with the floors in the laundry. When she had heartburn, she drank baking soda and water. She cared a great deal about how she looked, but she also cared a great deal about what she did. She never had a job, but she was a mainstay on the boards and committees of many worthy organizations. I'm sure I never articulated it, but basically my attitude towards both these images of adult womanhood was, I say it's spinach, and I say the hell with it. Luckily, I had other models for what a girl could do and be. I read a lot as a child, and I could not help but notice that my favorite heroines were not accommodating, surface-obsessed, boy-crazy, or passive. Frances Hodgson Burnett's crabby, self-absorbed Mary Lennox, George MacDonald's cheerful whirlwind, Princess Irene, even C.S. Lewis's gay and golden-haired Lucy Pevensey, all act straightforwardly without feeling the need to exercise their feminine wiles or manipulate the males around them. And most of them, certainly the ones whose adventures I most enjoyed, were the heroines of fantasies.
I have never understood people, especially kids, who wanted to read about the real world. The doleful here and now, where the waist of one's jeans is the object of social stratification, and the acquisition of a boyfriend is grounds for tragedy or redemption. Sorry, not interested. To read such a book for me would be the equivalent of living in Cleveland, which I did, and taking your summer vacation in Akron. Pause for Ohio people to explain why this is funny. So for me, the sweep of the strange, whether it was the March family in ancient Concord, or some kids in England finding a magic amulet they could wish on, or farther still, to the lamppost-infested forests of Narnia, the dragonish seas of Earthsea, the perilous mountains of Middle-earth. These were places where a kid might breathe free, where a lungful of air yielded a head full of possibilities, rich and strange. And best of all, in the children's books I loved, was that the protagonists in these fine works, in the ancient Greek sense of protagonist as the one who competes in the games, the lead actor in the drama, the most essential player was always a kid.
As rebellions go, my habit of consulting my inner Mary Lennox, or even my inner Eowyn when I got older, was not on a par with the 60s standards of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But I think I can safely say that it made my life a lot more interesting than it would have been. When I could not be bold as myself, sometimes I could be bold as a character in a book. As Sarah Crew in 4th grade, I told my story, The Curse of the Dancing Fairy, to the girls sitting at the table at lunch. As Dorothy and Alice, I learned the neat trick of questioning authority while minding my manners. More importantly, reading books in which talking animals and Greek demigods and goblins and witches helped the protagonists as often as they hindered them reset my rather narrow definition of terms like normal and community, and even us and them. I don't think you can read and love fantasy without learning that friends and allies do not always look or think just as you do.
In children's fantasy, kids are important. They are the agents of change. They are the winners of the ultimate games. Kids have real power. How very different from the home life of our own dear queen, as some eminent Victorian is said to have murmured during the climax of a performance of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. I love that. Very different from the home life of our own dear queen. The home was okay, but outside the family gates, in the real world, I was the school weird kid. The one who read the wrong things, wore the wrong things, wrote the wrong things, said the wrong things, asked the wrong questions, gave the wrong answers, listened to the wrong music, and kicked the ball all wrong. But all those qualities that made me an outcast amongst my well-groomed peers were, fantasy assured me, the very things that would win me my rightful place as the true prince, the heir to the magic, the fixer of the broken, the mender of ways and restorer of streets to dwell in. Because fantasy privileges being weird. Fantasy does not tell you how to make the best of things or how to become better adjusted with your peers. Fantasy says, screw them, we can do better than this. Even Harry Potter, who at Hogwarts comes as close to being a cool kid as you can get, which is sometimes a little too close for my comfort, some of the issues with Harry Potter, starts out a total reject in the real world, the real world. Even he has to come to the place he belongs. And I knew I would too. When I found that magic coin, when I found the back of the wardrobe, when my real people came for me on their unicorns out of the little forest behind our school and invited me to join them, when I didn't realize it was when I grew up. It's a long time to wait. Too long. Between then and then, you need a little hope, along with a whole lot of coping mechanisms, like the ones Delia just described. Sure, I dream of going back in time to tell that little kid that she's special, that ordinary kids are no big deal, that I had a poet's heart, and someday I'd be happy and find my people and my place in the world. But what kid believes that? It makes no sense. The world is now, not in the future. And besides, in so much children's fantasy, the whole point of magic is that you have to be a child to see it, to use it, and to deserve it.
In the stories I loved best as a child, magic is a subtle thing. No arcane rituals, no worlds or civilizations hanging in the balance, no thundering battles between absolute good and absolute evil for me. I was, and am, drawn to magic that is, rather than magic that does. Magic that is an integral and natural part of the person who is using it, rather than magic that must be learned. This is the magic of unicorns, fairies, undines. It is also the magic of children. In fantasy after fantasy, children are able to see and know things that adults cannot. There it is, without explanation and without apology. Explicitly in books like Peter Pan, The Chronicles of Narnia, Mary Poppins, implicitly in Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden and Edward Eger's Knight's Castle. It grows, of course, out of the romantic idea expressed in Wordsworth's ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood, that infants retain a deep memory of the presence of God from before their birth, not in entire forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. In fantasy, the clouds of glory that Wordsworth imagined as a child's birthright become a sensitivity to the speech of animals and the presence of magical beings. Very often, it is this power that allows child heroes to survive the indifference or downright cruelty of the world around them. No adult, unable to see Irene's grandmother or feel her magic thread, could have helped George MacDonald's princess escape from the goblins as Curdie did. This is the kind of magical help that inspires those who do not resonate with fantasy to say that it is an escapist literature, where rescue comes too easily and magic fixes everything. And sometimes that's true. It is also true that in the best of these books, it is not the kindly wizard or the magic fishbone or the enchanted flute that saves the day, but the child who has earned the right and the knowledge to use it. Fantasy offers children narratives for powerless characters like themselves to overcome powerful and menacing figures. Whenever I hear anyone say that fairy tales are too gory or scary for small children, I always think of what G.K. Chesterton said about dragons. I was never sure of the exact quotation, so I went and looked it up. It turns out to be in an essay called The Red Angel. Here is the relevant paragraph. Fairy tales, he writes, are not responsible for producing in children fear or any of the shapes of fear. Fairy tales do not give the child the idea of the evil or the ugly. That is in the child already because it is in the world already. The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he had an imagination. What the fairy tale provides for him is a St. George to kill the dragon. Chesterton is writing about fairy tales here, but the sentiment is equally applicable as an answer to Megan Cox-Gurdon's recent highly controversial Wall Street Journal article, Darkness Too Visible, in which she laments what she perceives as the unrelenting darkness of current YA fiction. Read fantasy for fairy tales and Buffy and vampire for St. George and the Dragon, and the parallels become obvious. To restate MacDonald, the adolescent has known vampires intimately ever since she had an imagination. What fantasy provides is a Buffy to slay the vampires. Fantasists know that children face metaphorical dragons and vampires every day, from schoolyard bullies to exploiting adults, from fear of bodily harm to fear of social failure. They also know that it is not particularly entertaining or even particularly convincing to be reassured that dragons are not really real, that bullies are insecure cowards who will back off if you just pull yourself together and face them down.
You need to sneak it in subversively. Kids know when they're being preached to, and some of us resent it. Yes, there are people on this planet who genuinely like a good moral, and for them we have what I used to snottily refer to as the "my brother is a drug addict and Susie has an abortion" genre. The problem books that sprang up in my early teens. And I've almost forgiven my best friend from junior high for giving me, for my birthday, she, honest to God, she gave me a pamphlet from that lefty bookstore down on Coventry. It was like Yin Yang, the heroic barefoot doctor of the revolution. When she knew what I really wanted was earrings and a Starship Enterprise. I am still speaking to her, but it took a little while. No, I am, and always was, eager to engage with the great social issues of our and every other age. Sexism, racism, classism, and that annoying habit other people have of being complete idiots. It's just that, like Kipling's schoolboys, I believe there's no sense in not doing a thing stalkily while you're about it. The great American fantasist Ursula Le Guin has written convincingly and movingly about the ways that fantasy reveals truth more surely than mere realism does, and I thank Amanda for quoting her. She's also taken on Why Americans Are Afraid of Dragons. She's our great champion, and I cannot better her, Ursula, not Amanda, although I doubt I can better Amanda either. And it appears that I cannot quote Le Guin while Amanda can. All I can do is offer my own humble metaphor here. So back to our engagement with those burning social issues as mediated by our choice of fiction. I need my socially improving message to be well-dressed, costumed, if you will, for a grand and glorious ball, maybe a masked ball, where identities are both hidden and revealed through the choice of costume. My beloved college Shakespeare professor, Edward Taylor of Columbia, was the one who first put that idea into my head. Our choice of costume, he used to say, reveals who we are deep down inside, more surely than our carefully selected real-world daily choice of, say, which car we drive, which length of skirt or earrings we wear, the necktie or lack of it. These are the daylight choices we make in the mirror, with our eyes wide open to how we wish society to view us, fully conscious of what each of them implies. The choices we make for a night of revelry, actually what Professor Taylor used to say was he would say that the mask reveals us. The choices we make for a night of revelry, a night of disguise, when rules are overturned and nothing has consequence after the clock has struck 12 and daylight returns us to the cars and the skirt lengths. Those are the masks we put on to show the world our secret, hidden selves. The shy man reveals his inner boldness. The modest woman, her naughty bits. The mouthy rebel, her lust for the perfectly rigid and constricting corset. So let it be with literature. I will not sit still while someone tells me how to behave well and treat others decently. And I bet you won't either. But put a sword in my hand and the threat of a fierce and final battle with various creatures so horrible that if I were to describe them, the grown-ups wouldn't let you read this book. And then tell me what it really means to be a king. It is to be the first in every desperate attack and last in every desperate retreat. And when there's hunger in the land, to laugh louder over a scantier meal than anyone. And it's a lesson I'll not soon forget.
As you may have gathered by now, I was not a heroic child. Chronic asthma chained me to my bed for days and weeks at a time, and severely limited my options for physical daring-do. While I certainly loved the more swashbuckling heroes, the Pippi Longstockings, the Jill Pulls, the Ariettis, I was more at home with characters like the practical Princess Alicia from Dickens's The Magic Fishbone and E. Nesbit's Dickie from Harding's Luck, whose problems could not be solved by sword and buckler, however magical. Fantasy honors dreamers. This was a great comfort to me, a daydreamer myself, who stared out windows with unfocused eyes, off in a world of my own. Dans la lune, my French teacher called it, fixing me with her beady dark eye. Spending time in the moon did not fix the rules governing French irregular verbs firmly in my mind. But it did, I think, turn me into a writer. My mind was busy as I stared out those windows with trying to decide what 3 wishes I would ask for if I ever met a fairy, with wondering things like what Sleeping Beauty might have been dreaming during her long sleep, with making up stories that looked very much like the 5 children in It, only with no siblings and a magical creature that didn't creep me out as much as the sunlight, and a problem with the eyes and the stars. Dreaming alone didn't turn me into a writer. Like Taran in Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain, I had to learn to do what it takes to bring my dreams to fruition. Doers, like Mitt and Diana Wynne Jones's Drowned Amit, have to learn to dream to give their actions focus and meaning. From fantasy, I learned that warriors can be poets and poets can be warriors, and that on the whole, the world works better when action is tempered by thought. Fantasy is the literature of optimism. Its narratives move from a stable but untenable order through destabilizing adventures, misunderstandings, and hardships to a new, improved order in which the characters can grow and develop towards adulthood. Fantasies tend towards redemption, integration, restoration. They are full of abandoned children who find homes, troubled children who win through hardship to peace and prosperity, lonely children who find community.
And so I came at last unto my own country. And it was the country of the writer, the country of the artist. It was the country of the one who had agency, the one who could act, The one who wrote stories and was paid for them. And more importantly, was published. This in the days before internet, my children, when that was pretty much the only way that your stories could be read by more than 10 people. Really. Just imagine it. But I always wonder if internet and fan fiction and all that had existed when I was 20, would I ever have bothered to publish, or would the fact that 200 people kept saying, wow, I really love that, have come enough? Other people could read my stories. People I didn't even know were reading my work. And what was I trying to tell them? What changes did I hope to effect? What grand revolutions and empowerments? Well, I myself have long believed that if you know how the trick is done, you won't enjoy it as much. I know not everyone feels that way. I am the one, though, who leaves the room when we hit the DVD extras that show how they blue screened in The Dragon. So I tried to give kids what I had wanted myself. I know I'm not the first writer to say this. Writing for kids is, in a way, always giving a present back to the kid you were, the one who made you who you are today, and to the kid you still are to some extent. The first books I was paid to write were 5 choose-your-own adventures, which I did on commission while struggling with my first novel, Swords Point. I started out with a choose-your-own about a kid who's at summer camp doing archery and winds up meeting Robin Hood and having adventures in the merry greenwood with him and Marion and all the outlaws. Because what kid wouldn't want that?
The first book I ever remember reading for myself, just before I began first grade, was Howard Pyle's The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. I loved it unreservedly, experiencing for the first time the spell cast by a distant time and place, a spell that never lost its hold on me. Robin Hood gave me a taste for Lincoln Green and alfresco picnics. It also gave me a basic notion of social justice. Robin Hood taught me that the rich should give to the poor, and if they don't want to, they should be made to. A different child might have turned to revolution and open rebellion against the system, not me. I was the child who sat in the corner, envious and terrified, while the bolder girls in my rather prim all-girls school demanded the right to wear knee socks with our uniforms in winter. I was the teenager squirming while my parents made sweeping generalizations about Jews and Catholics and people of color, knowing they were being at best unfair, at worst unpardonably stupid, but unable to bring myself to argue with them. Even as an adult and a writer, I am still not comfortable with tackling subjects like racism, class prejudice, sexism, emotional and physical abuse head on. Like C.S. Lewis, who cloaked Jesus in a lion's skin and placed him in a fictional world side by side with dryads and fauns and centaurs and dwarves and talking animals, I prefer to explore my deepest concerns through metaphor and image. This is not a matter of conscious choice. My story ideas most often come to me not as themes or characters or even situations, but as scenes and emotions. The germ of my forthcoming novel, The Freedom Maze, was a dream of a girl, myself as a child, reading on a window seat overlooking a hedge maze. As she, as I, looked up from the book, the scene changed from present to past, the maze from overgrown tangle to manicured precision. An animal ran into it, an animal with piebald fur, an animal my dreaming self knew to be magical. I don't remember what happened next, or anything else about the dream, but what I do remember, the thing that sustained me through nearly 20 years of rewriting, publishing snafus, and more rewriting, is that I wanted to reach the center of that maze, to explore its secrets and uncover its magic. That piebald animal led me into a maze of history and research, through memories of visiting my mother's relatives in Louisiana in the 1960s and extensive research into life on a sugar plantation in the 1860s. It led me to thoughts about slavery and freedom, about the construction of race, about the price of silence in the face of injustice and the price of rebellion against it. It led me to consider the threads of racism, both submerged and overt, that tie the American past to the American present and shape far too much of our culture. Without the mediation of my magical creature and the device of time travel, I never would have been able to tackle such uncomfortable, controversial material.
As a writer, I took a different path. I never stopped loving and reading children's fantasy, but to my own surprise, except for those choose-your-own adventures, I started out writing for adults. And my work is nothing like the writers I love to read, like Tolkien. I'll talk a little more about that later. My only real children's book, as opposed to some young adult fiction, just published in late 2007, is an illustrated chapter book called The Golden Dreidel, which started out life as a holiday special for public radio called The Golden Dreidel, a klezmer nutcracker for Hanukkah. It's also available as an album. In it, I finally came to grips with my childhood love of C.S. Lewis, Madeline L'Engle, Elizabeth Goudge, and all the other great Anglican fantasists. I was brought up in a fairly observant Jewish family. We kept kosher, observed all the holidays, and my mother reads Hebrew fluently, so when I dropped out of Hebrew school, she tutored me at home. We read the book of Samuel together, and it was fantastic. King David is just King Arthur, only in a hot country. But at the same time, I also believed in Aslan, without, of course, knowing why I wasn't supposed to. I'm not saying the way C.S. Lewis wrote it. So in my dreams, fed by my reading, I lived in a world of Celtic myth and Anglican morality. So in The Golden Dreidel, that's my reimagining of the Nutcracker Ballet plot, as much as the Nutcracker Ballet has a plot. We added a few things, with a modern feminist Jewish mythic base. My heroine Sarah gets a present at a family Hanukkah party from her magic auntie. It's like, why are guys always magical and charismatic and women, adult women, slightly comical? Harry Potter. So I created this very, very charismatic, magical, wonderful, fabulous adult female person. And the dreidel, instead of a nutcracker, it's a dreidel, and it's a princess instead of a prince, but it's a girl her own age, so there's no icky romance. And then they all go to a magical world in which all the fantastical elements come from Jewish folklore and ethics. Because I really wanted to take all the things that had moved me about Narnia and replace Lewis's Christian and pagan bias with a similarly powerful, deep-rooted Jewish one. So that was the masquerade I chose to cloak my passions in. The fantasy adventure I wanted to give a little kid somewhere who might be like me. American, not British. Ethnic, not Anglo, but hungering for the rich and strange. My only concern is that because it's Jewish, I'm afraid that only Jewish kids will be encouraged to read it. Because I'm no C.S. Lewis, and I gotta say this book, it ain't no Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But I hope it's a little better than just to be relegated to that little corner of the library. And if it's not, at least I tried.
I am an almost native New Yorker. My parents moved there when I was 3. It may be difficult for a casual visitor to believe this, but to a child growing up there, it is one of the most magical of cities. It isn't beautiful, but it is almost preternaturally alive. And one of the most alive spots in it is Central Park. When I was little, I longed to live in the park in Belvedere Castle, a neo-Gothic folly perched high on a granite outcropping overlooking Turtle Pond and the Great Lawn. Since Belvedere Castle is a weather station, that was never a possibility, but I came to know the park intimately anyway. I caught tadpoles in the boat pond, chased fireflies under the trees, traded secrets with my best friend in the ramble, and avoided the red-eyed, feral-looking men sleeping on the park benches. There is nothing that says that fantasy is that the fairies are all nice. I could see no reason that fairies would not be perfectly happy in the copses and waterways of Central Park. You may imagine my reaction, therefore, when during a week-long conference on fairies in upstate New York, a British artist and fairy enthusiast remarked that he did not believe that fairies could exist in cities. Not liking to tell him he was wrong to his face, what could I do but write a book that demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt just how wrong he was? The fairies I ended up writing about are New York fairies. Most of them are kobolds, swan maidens, leprechauns, fairies, pixies, and other folkloric characters brought to America in their mental baggage by the immigrants of 1,000 nations. But there are native New York fairies as well, spontaneously generated genius loci and New York fairy folk, spawned by the restless energy of the city itself and all the imaginations at work in it. I stole my producer of Broadway from Damon Runyon, and the genius of the Plaza Hotel from Kay Thompson's Eloise. I imagined a Swan Lake direct danced and flown by genuine swan maidens, and a school for human changelings to teach them not to perform magic themselves, but how to survive living amongst the quarrelsome, obsessive, rude, rule-bound, easily offended fairy folk. Changeling and the magic mirror of the Mermaid Queen are my valentines to folklore and children's books and to the city I grew up in. They also turn out to be a remarkably accurate mirror of what it's like for a child to live there now. When I do school visits in New York, the classes I address are made up of children whose parents or grandparents are as likely to have come from Jamaica, China, Vietnam, Russia, Romania, Brazil, India, or the Dominican Republic as Ireland, Germany, Scotland, or England. These children are not used to seeing their folklore integrated into the melting pot, as their families have been. I remember one first-generation Chinese-American fourth grader telling me how happy he was that I put Chinese fairies in the book. For me, it was a no-brainer. Who else would live in Chinatown? But he hadn't thought of the creatures of folklore following his family to his new home. I was pleased when the class agreed that one of the things that they liked best about New York Between was that it had all different kinds of fairies in it, and that they all seemed at home there.
Adults read children's fantasy, and children read adult novels. Everybody knows that. I was still a bit surprised when two of my adult novels, Thomas the Rhymer and The Privilege of the Sword, were listed as New York Public Library best books for the teenage. But in the realm of fantasy, there seems to be a little more flex. Young adult writer Scott Westerfeld always says that's what he likes about writing for kids, is that they haven't learned to be closed-minded about genre yet. Well, my first novel, Swords Point, I wouldn't call it a kid's book. It's pretty racy, and it was considered even more so when it appeared first in 1987. But now, this kills me, many people are telling me that today it would be considered a young adult novel. So I think about this. And it's true that it's kind of a coming-of-age story for one character. The mysterious university dropout Alec is a self-destructive late adolescent. He's full of rage at everyone and everything, and he lets the world know it every chance he gets. But because his boyfriend is the fastest sword in town, Alec can be obnoxious and live. So I was 22 when I started writing those characters, and I was living in a bad part of New York, and well, that's what I came up with. My nameless city is full of raffish lowlifes and aristocratic bisexuals, and the primary relationship in the book is queer. If the novel is fantasy at all, other than what we now call historical fantasy, which didn't really exist when I wrote it, and it was a big, shocking, horrible thing that this fantasy novel had no magic in it, I would say that the fantasy part of it, if it has to be labeled that, is a social fantasy. I'm imagining a world where one's choice of sexual partner is a lot more fluid as long as you adhere to the rest of the rules of society. My colleague here, the very historically minded Dr. Sherman, insisted then that we go back and examine just what in this society's history would create such a culture, and so we wrote together The Fall of the Kings, which is set in the same place about 60 years later than Swords Point, with the descendants of the Swords Point characters, exploring the ancient history of said place. And I will stop here to say that on Facebook, a librarian friend says, I must warn you all that despite its being upstairs in the conference bookshop, with that really pretty fairy tale-y Arthur Rackham cover. The Fall of the Kings is not a children's book by any stretch of the imagination. Although then one of my friend's daughters said, well, I read it when I was 13 and it didn't do me any harm. I think, no, that's not the same as saying, take this back and read it to your third graders. Since Swords Point's publication, I have had people come up to me, and this is the part I love, is people tell you what they read. And I could do a whole talk about that and how interesting and revealing that is. But in terms of revolution and change and what's really going on in books, I was really struck once by a young woman who said that her religion was very much against homosexuality, but she was so completely enchanted with the characters that at least for the space of the book, she was able to let that go. And I've had gay men and women say it's such a relief to see the fact that they are queer characters, but that that's not an issue, that the whole book isn't about, oh no, I'm gay, I must now empower myself. Let alone, which is often where the novels begin and end, let alone the fact that the meanest, toughest guy on the block is the guy who is sleeping with another guy and defending him against all comers. So that was, it's been very interesting for me, again, just realizing what it is people need to find in their fiction and where they are able to find it. Swords Point's real sequel, The Privilege of the Sword, was published after The Fall of the Kings, and it was again published as an adult fantasy in 2006, but I would say that that is a young adult novel. It's a genuine coming-of-age story. It's narrated by a 15-year-old girl, and in fact, lots of teen readers have cheerfully adopted it, and lots of librarians, thank you, have given it to YA readers. It's very much about the role of women and girls in my imaginary society. While I was writing it, I was really worried that what I was writing was the great feminist liberation novel for 1811. And that the need for a book like that was long gone. And so it was with a little bit of horror that I received the love of teenage girls coming up to me and saying how much the book meant to them. I mean, I love it. I don't mean literally horror, but that it's chilling to me. Because I thought we were past all that, the ways in which a girl needs to develop her own agency and stand on her own, and all of that they're still with us. It's both lovely to know that I did something that made a difference, and sad to know how much of a difference in some ways it made. So we don't always know as authors with our books what powers we are unleashing on the world, what strength and courage we are giving the hurt and powerless, what strange wounds we are tending, what secrets we are whispering. We choose our masks, make them as stunning as possible, and go out to the dance.
We have time for questions?
Questions or comments? Questions? Comments? Questions and comments? No, really. There's a lot we didn't talk about in this, and I will gladly yatter on, but would love to have a question.
Well, I was really interested by what you said about, the fantasy, privileging the weird kids and having, no sort of knowledge, or maybe not placing too much importance on when you're a kid, the idea that actually in the future, when you're an adult, being weird will kind of have its own payoff and you'll find your place. I was wondering, with that in mind, if you would just comment on the role, how adults and growing up are depicted in children's literature, because I think it can be often negative. So,
in fantasy particularly, because once you stop being a child, you lose the power. That's a big issue. You thought, also, we never made it quite clear. I'm Ellen. She's Delia.
That is a strange one, because there are actually a lot. You have to have an antagonist, and the antagonist is most often an adult, because that is the greatest antagonist in a child's life for the most part. But on the other hand, the greatest helpers are also usually adults, or animals that behave a lot like adults, so that there is an image of something that has that kind of wisdom that is not the grown-up that you don't want to be. And I think that as long as that adult is removed in some way, is actually the weird kid, as it were, amongst the adults, that if you're that kind of child, then you're more likely to grow up to be a magic adult. Possibly not a magic animal, but at least it gives you. I don't think that it's not that literal-minded. It's more like that you don't have a specific thing that you're aspiring for, but you do have a series of attributes that you're aspiring for, and that those become your attributes, and it doesn't have to be like anything. It's you, and I think that is actually, as I'm thinking about it, something that holds to every book that is going through my mind right this minute. There are probably books in which that is not the case.
But I would argue that childhood takes a really, really long time, and by the time you're out of it anyway. So, and you kind of can't help it. It's very interesting. And therefore, that really, what these books are doing is empowering you to be the best kid you can be. And once you move out of childhood, it turns out some of the ways you can be the best kid also make you the best adult. But unless, I think there are specifically novels about moving from childhood into adulthood, or from childhood into young adulthood, or young adulthood into adulthood. But I'm a big believer in just learn how to be a really great kid. And I think it's just like, when you're at I'm actually not a sports fan, so this may be the world's worst metaphor, but when you're living in a city, you root for the team. When you're a kid, you root for Team Kid. At least that was my experience. That's not really yours as much. And I know kids who say, I hated other kids. Well, I did too, but I liked being a kid. And that you wanted kids to be the it, and books that reinforce that and go, yes, kids are it, kids are the best, are actually, I think, really terrific and really useful. And I remember being terribly worried that I would lose magic as I got older, that I would lose my faith, essentially. And in some ways I did, but you only lose it when there's something to replace it. It's not like you wake up one day and go, magic isn't real and my world is terrible. Well, actually, yes, it's called adolescence. But that's why we had Star Trek and guitars and, now you have other things. So
there is a real, most of the stuff that I was talking about, and there is a real difference, I think, in the way that young adult fantasy and children's fantasy deals with the whole growing up thing. And I think that really what children's fantasy does is give you a way of being a child, and what young adult, it's coming of age. It's the movement towards adulthood. Whereas childhood is not the movement towards adulthood, it's the movement towards taking the next step. And so I think that really you don't have to have a great adult role model in a children's book. In young adult books, you often do. You often have some sort of figure who gives advice, or who is something that somebody can aspire to. So I think that there's a real difference there in children's and in young adult.
Come on, just push the button. Yeah.
I was curious, since you write about like queer YA, what would you like to see in like that future of the genre? Like as writers, what would you guys like to see in the future of the genre of queer YA?
More queer YA!
I actually think that having people have relationships and having a story that was not about being queer, but that there could be a character, a major character, who was queer and had relationship issues, but that the issue was not that it was a queer relationship, would be a real step forward, because it would whenever you're talking about the problem of empowerment, you're talking about something you perceive as a problem. If it's not a problem and you've got other things, then you can have a more realistic depiction of the emotional life that you have it. And I think that for that, in some ways it's easier to do in fantasy, because it's that removal thing. It's not happening to us, it's happening in that universe over there that isn't actually real. But that helps normalize it in people's minds.
Yeah, I think that's really important and really useful. And there's an adult series that's having a little discussion with a colleague about whether it could count as YA or not. But Laurie J. Marks has a fantasy series that Delia was actually the editor on, called Elemental Logic. The first one is
The first one is Fire Logic.
Fire Logic, Earth Logic, and Water Logic, and those just absolutely normalize queerness in a society where there's a lot of different things, but it's not shocking and it's not particularly exciting. And I really feel like what I said about the Orthodox kid who read Sword's Point, that if you just perceive it in another world as something reasonably normal and now let's all get on with it, I think that's tremendously powerful in a way that no amount of, all right, we're going to deal with this now in high school, in Smallville or Allentown, will do. For some people. Some people do not have fantasy receptors, and that's okay. Like, some people don't like duck, you know. It's okay. You don't have to like everything. But and there's no way you can convince someone who doesn't like, you know, carrots that carrots are yummy, because carrots are not yummy to them. So, but for those who have the receptors or who can be convinced to at least try one bite, you might like it.
You, Adriana. Sorry.
Oh, I was just, when you were talking about the adults versus kids thing, the story I flashed on immediately was The Wizard of Oz. So Dorothy is the child, and then the adults become these helpers, who are the fantasy helpers, and then the wizard is this like bogus, lying adult. Is that what
You're talking about the movie, not the book, right?
No, actually, it's
Yeah, I'm actually talking about the movie because
well,
the book is so different than the movie.
The issue I really have about The Wizard of Oz is that the movie is that it's a dream, and in the book it happens. She really goes to Oz. There is none of this, and then she woke up, and the Tin Man looked exactly like Alf and whatever their names were. It just they're not adults. He's a Tin Man. He's not he may be a grown-up Tin Man, but he does not read as a Tin Man because he's a Tin Man. They are magical creatures, and therefore they trump their age. They could be 500 years old, they could be 3 hours old, it doesn't matter, that's what they are. They are unchanging. And that I think is the real difference between the movie and the book. And I also think that movies have a tendency to be culturally far more conservative than literature does. That there is much more exciting things going on the page than the marketplace will allow to go on screen.
Now we should have done a 10-minute talk and then just had you all ask questions. Do we have time for one more?
Sure. Anybody has anything to, yes?
Earlier, Delia was talking about being a child and having asthma and connecting that with writing with fantasy. I was thinking about an essay by Virginia Woolf called I'm Being Ill, and that led me to think about all these different writers, like Robert Louis Stevenson, who worked in the fantasy genre, who also have the experience of being ill. And I'm really struck by how some of my students believe so firmly that they have free will. And yet, I'm not sure if a child who is suffering from some kind of chronic illness can believe that they can just think themselves well. I mean, you don't just.
But did you just say your students think they have free will and can think themselves well?
Well, they think that whatever, no. They just tell me that you can be anything that you want to be, as long as you really want it.
Oh, that's just what they told them in school.
But I'm interested in how a child who knows they can't just think themselves able to walk, if they can't, or if they have some serious illness. I'm wondering if anybody's done any work on the attraction of fantasy for those children.
I really don't know.
Ask your peers.
Yeah.
We have no idea.
We have no idea. But my feeling, I mean, you're right, and Rosemary Sutcliffe was confined to her bed for most of her childhood. There are a lot of people who had very happy childhoods and then miserable adolescences and adulthoods who have written children's books. And I think that there is escapism in children's literature, and I think that is a good thing, because when you're lying in bed, seeing the alternative, not necessarily that I am going to be like that, but that there is the possibility of escape, and I'm holding it in my hands, is empowering in its own way. So being entertained with something that you can imagine yourself doing, given once you get well, I think that it's more important really for a child, not the physical limitations, but the mental, that I can imagine doing this and I don't have to have a body while I'm reading. At least I think that is the way I remember it. My favorite book, which I read ritually whenever I was sick, was Swiss Family Robinson. Because they were so, no matter what happened, Mama could put her hand in the magic bag and seeds would come out. It must have been the size of, you know, a steamer trunk. But everything came out of that magic bag and they could contrive. And that was just, I mean, I must have found it comforting because I read it over and over and over and over again.
I think we've come to, oh yeah.
I work in a small children's independent bookstore, and I'm going to say the evil word, Kindle. And
we get more money actually if it's an ebook, so yay, Kindle.
But what I think that kids, their parents have Kindles, but they aren't buying Kindles for their children yet. And especially the young adult readers want to read a lot of the graphic novels and Ellen Hopkins, and we're into that kind of stuff right now. And I just wondered how you felt about with the closing of Borders or the bankruptcy of Borders as writers, and also how you do feel about the Kindle and the loss of the book, the page.
You know, you can't stop progress. I'm sorry, I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. I also have run out of bookshelves. And the thought that I can carry when I travel 15 books in my phone is actually kind of nice. It's also, I don't think children who read books on electronic devices, if they love it, they will buy it, as long as there is a book to buy. I think that publishing on demand may become more important so that they don't print all of these books that they don't know how to sell. I really suffer for the independent bookstore because I love them, I grew up with them. Even in New York, there were bookstores every once in a week. They were in the neighborhood, and you could go there, and there were people you knew, and they would say, "Here, have this book." And that just, I don't know what's going to happen with that. But you know, how can you tell? We don't know. We are in the middle of change, and you can never tell where the change is going when you're in the middle of it. You just can't. We could look back and say, "Oh, of course, it's obvious," but when you're in the middle of it, you can't. You can't tell. So. It will be what it will be, and I will be very curious to see what it is, but I have no idea.
I mean, I will say that one thing that I love, I mean, the internet has changed everything, and that's part of the continuum that Kindle is on, but the fact that one can now speak directly to readers is amazing to me and fantastic, and means that you no longer have to worry about, you know, how many copies of your book Barnes & Noble bought for the entire freaking country because one person made a decision. And if you want to, and you do not have to physically go from town to town, you know, having your little reading, you can do an online interview live. You can have, we had an incredible, the thing I wanted to talk about in the talk, but I couldn't squeeze it in, was the Welcome to Bordertown project, which is the revival of this amazing, life-changing YA series that got started in the 80s by Terry Windling. Before there really was YA, I have a whole thing on how Terry invented YA. And Holly Black and I have revived this series with the original writers and the writers of her generation who grew up reading this series. And getting the word, first of all, finding out who the writers were who grew up reading it that we wanted to invite in the anthology, partly done through the internet, through stealthy little means, and then of course getting the word out that there was going to be a new Bordertown book after 13 years. We did all kinds of very cool, fun stuff, and also, frankly, getting to read people's little blog reviews or just their responses to your Twitter. You're so much more connected to the reading audience than we could have dreamed of when we got into this business, and I love that. Or the fact that I can send a postcard that I do not have to physically stamp to, you know, 2,000 people. It's just fantastic to me. There's a lot to be said for the modern world, so I won't hear a word against it. And, you know, there's always melancholy for what passes and for the physical sensations of things that are passing. Of course there is. And then the frightening thing is what's happening. The bookstore is what's happening. Barnes & Noble, where will the power devolve? I mean, will it become more egalitarian, you know, with everybody just kind of seeing that there's a book out, reading a review and going, wow, I should go to Amazon and order it at once, versus having to see whether a copy is in the store. You know, nobody knows. Publishing is in spasms. It's in paroxysms of terror and freak out, and people are being hired and people are being fired and contracts are changing, and it's a really what the Chinese would call an interesting time. But I'm ride the waves, wait out, there'll be something, and we'll all find out what it is, and then we can have an opinion about that. Thank you all so very much. We look forward to spending the whole